I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favour of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024-835 please raise their hand? Those against? The result of the voting is as follows: 14 votes in favour, 1 vote against, 0 abstentions. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council.
This is our PSA for November 22nd, 2024, and that was the fourth vote on the UN ceasefire resolution to end active hostilities in Gaza since October 7th of last year. It's the fourth time the United States has vetoed such a resolution. This is not the only significant vote this week, nor was it the only major news coming out of the UN. Samer will help us understand two significant votes in the US Congress this week. One of those correlates to our conversation with Dylan Saba of Palestine Legal about Project Esther that we had last week, specifically the passage of H.R. 9495, which empowers the President of the United States via the Treasury Department to unilaterally end tax-exempt status for nonprofits using an overly broad definition of terrorism. The other was the much-anticipated JRD vote to block $20 billion in U.S. weapons to Israel, supported by Senator Bernie Sanders. And of course, on the UN side of things, there was also the long-awaited announcement of arrests from the ICC, including warrants against Yoav Gallant and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Yet among all of those developments, this now familiar scene of a U.S. ambassador, this time U.S. Ambassador Robert Wood, and their outstretched hand standing alone against the otherwise unanimity of the Security Council and the world to end the brutal violence in Gaza encapsulates both the extreme isolation and culpability this administration has placed the United States in, now just weeks from the end of a now infamous Democratic presidency. It also embodies where the U.S. has brought the international order. Chinese Ambassador Fu Kong said that quote, the repeated use of veto by the United States has reduced the authority of the Security Council and international law to an all-time low. Majid Bamia, one of Palestine's UN envoys, has not been deluded about the ramifications of a possible ceasefire from the Security Council, but reiterated its dire importance in light of the US government's intentional obstruction of peace through this veto. It doesn't resolve everything, he said, but it is the first step to resolving anything. Samer, a lot happened this week. It's great to have you back. We started on another somber note of yet another failed UN resolution, but there's always more to it than just the end result of these various votes and political measures. So I'm looking forward to hearing what your analysis is on what's been behind them and surrounding them as they've made their way into Congress and as these ICC warrants, which we've been talking about since I can't remember when, have been a possibility, and what the possible implications are for peace at this stage and for other interventions. So again, great to have you back. And since we have a lot to cover, I won't waste much time other than to give you the floor.
Thanks so much, Thomas. As always, what a week. So much to go over, but we'll go through it piece by piece. Another 500 or so increase in the death toll, and I think we are seeing a few different things happening here that we'll get into in a little bit more detail. But the ongoing pressure in Lebanon to try to force Hezbollah into a ceasefire is part of it, but also this repeated pattern of every time Israel gets embarrassed on the global stage, it takes it out on Palestinians and now on Lebanese too. So we're seeing sort of retaliatory strikes after what happened at the ICC and some other stuff that happened this week. And we'll get into a lot of that in more detail. But per usual, starting in southern Gaza and working our way up, the Israeli attacks on Gaza's infrastructure continue despite the extent to which this has already taken place. In Rafah, the last remaining government hospital has just been destroyed. So the ongoing sort of attempt to undermine the infrastructure of life in the Gaza Strip really sort of continues unabated here. Uh, the other little bit of Rafah news that came out this week was, now that Trump's victory is secured and Bibi can gloat all he wants, we're seeing some like behind the scenes stuff about how Bibi explained Biden's red line on Gaza and how basically he like laughed in Biden's face when Biden said um, that Israel wouldn't be allowed to invade Rafah. And the way that Bibi describes it, which is of course like this really bombastic, over the top, sort of ridiculous retelling, is you know Biden telling him that if Israel goes into Rafah, then Israel will be all alone. And so Netanyahu says, then we'll do it alone. And we'll fight with our hands and sticks if we have to, which like obviously is totally untrue. And you know, no one ever stopped him from doing anything anyway. So just an absurd anecdote to cap off a really absurd campaign. In southern to central Gaza and Khan Yunis and Deir al-Balah, I did want to like highlight one uplifting story that I really appreciated about how like the continued resilience and steadfastness of folks in Gaza, even now 13, 14 months into this round of the genocide, where even just the mud that's being left behind is being salvaged to create like new homes for people. Obviously, at nowhere near the scale that needs to be done for the 2 million people who are displaced, but um, it's a sign of like the continued will to life that exists there that I try to take some comfort and succor from when I'm feeling overwhelmed. Um, in the context of that is, of course, the worst humanitarian situation that Gaza has experienced so far. It's hard to say because the information is so spotty, but many aid groups are saying that it has never been worse than it is right now. And what we're seeing, in places like Deir al-Balah, which is that bakeries are completely shutting down because even access to basic things like flour don't seem to be accessible right now. Um, and that's in the context of, this ostensible humanitarian surge that is supposed to come as a result of that U.S. ultimatum that we talked about last week, the 30-day ultimatum to increase the number of trucks going into Gaza up to 350 from the average of about 50 or so before. And that's, just straight up not happening, obviously, which, I think will be a surprise to no one who is listening. There were a few articles about how, this honestly kind of bizarre Times of Israel article about how the US, directed Netanyahu to ensure 350 trucks would go in every day, which obviously they didn't do. Netanyahu responded by saying that they would increase the number of trucks to 250 per day, like specifically just to be like, we're not going to do what you asked us to, but here's as close as we're willing to get. And then obviously that turned out to be a lie too, and they're still not even doing 100. Um, what did come out this week that is particularly interesting is that perhaps unsurprisingly, the humanitarian surge, whatever idea and the logistics behind it were all sort of masterminded by private U.S. contractors. So like, these for-profit enterprises that the U.S. sort of outsources its diplomacy to, and these like security consulting companies that were supposed to design a new aid delivery system that clearly isn't working, given that not only is more aid not getting in, but the aid that is getting in is often being, it's fascinating because it's an argument that Israel continuously uses that it's not that we're not letting in aid, it's that the aid that's getting in is being blocked or being stolen and looted. And they're accusing Hamas of doing that. But what seems to be the case, and there were a few articles about it this week, including one in the Washington Post, is that gangs are basically operating in the security vacuum left behind by Israel, where they're specifically targeting the police forces and things. So gangs are basically extorting the aid and or taking it for themselves or looting aid trucks. And what we learned this week from a few articles, including this drop site article on the right here, talks about how Palestinian civilians have described how aid trucks are going in and are being watched by the IDF while they get looted or taken by gangs. And when police try to stop those gangs, the IDF shoots at the police. And so the fact that, this week, the security forces that still remain in Gaza managed to do this sort of large ambush of the gangs that were looting aid, I think tells us a lot about the state of governance in the Gaza Strip and the fact that, this police force, which is run by Hamas, right? Hamas is more than just its militant wing, it's also the operating government in Gaza to the extent that there is an operating government in Gaza. And so the fact that those police forces even still exist and they're able to be coordinated to this level to sort of secure aid in a way that obviously the Israeli occupying military is not only not securing, but is maybe actively undermining, I think, yeah, says a lot about the state of the governance there. But yeah, that sort of reassertion of government control, I think, is an interesting development. We'll see where it goes from there. Moving into the north, of course, where the general's plan continues to sort of strangle uh, the areas in, Gaza City, Jabalia, and Beit Lahia. Uh, we've seen another mass expulsion. This is, I don't know, I think the fourth or fifth at this point. Uh, and what happens here is they use these, I think they're called drainage points, right? Where they force everybody through these really narrow areas and then pull out all the men that they perceive to be of fighting age and then kick out everybody else and they're not allowed to return. Those are where ostensibly you may have seen some of the photos circulating social media this week of men in their underwear in the middle of winter boarding Israeli trucks and things. And the IDF has tried to justify those photographs as showing like the ability to sort of check for bombs or weapons for their military captives. But, like thinking about that for 2 seconds really shows you the underlying lie there. Like, even if they were stripped down to search for weapons, why are they still naked? Right? Like you can do that and then put clothes on them. And why are they being photographed being naked? Like it's clearly designed to be sexual humiliation, which is a long running tactic of the IDF, not only in the Gaza Strip, but elsewhere. Um, Elsewhere in northern Gaza, particularly in Beit Lahia, you're seeing more airstrikes, killing dozens of people, but also another concerted attack on the remaining hospital in the north, the Kamal Adwan Hospital, which I think we've been hearing about on and off for the past few weeks, where previously they had destroyed the hospital's power generators, and then this week they've destroyed their water supply system. So there's this sort of ongoing attempt again to undermine the remaining public infrastructure in the Strip. In the West Bank, we're seeing continued raids in Jenin. Another 5 or so Palestinians killed there. And like, settlers along with IDF soldiers setting fire to Palestinian homes and cars and whatnot. In part response to this, I do want to note maybe it's worth reflecting on the fact that we've been talking about the Israeli forces Jenin raid for 3 or 4 months at this point. So this idea of like a targeted operation to root out terrorists is obviously just turning into the same thing that was happening in Gaza, which is an ongoing occupation designed to make life there uninhabitable, and it is moving along quite quickly. Um, the U.S. has sanctioned another group that builds West Bank settlements, but we've talked in the past about how little these sanctions actually mean. And even in this AP article, they talk about how ineffective the sanctions have been, and how they generally just result in emboldening the settler movements even more. And the U.S. has been very specific about the fact that even though these groups are sanctioned, they're only sanctioned from the U.S. banking system, and the U.S. has no problem with these settler groups continuing to use European or Israeli or other banking systems, which is obviously not how U.S. sanctions work in Russia or places like that. The absolutely wild update from the West Bank this week, at least that I saw, was around the ending of administrative detention. This is a long-running policy because the West Bank is under military occupation. They don't use civilian courts; they use military courts, which also allows them to do this thing called administrative detention, where they hold people without any sort of trial, and they can hold Palestinians there for years without any sort of trial or without any explicit charges. And I initially was shocked to see that uh, administrative detention was ending, and then discovered that no, in fact, administrative detention is only ending for Jews in the West Bank. And there's a kind of wild quote in there about how it's totally unfair to force Jews to experience that sort of um, like torturous conditions in the situation that they're in right now. And of course, not a single mention of the over 3,000, like just shy of 3,500 or so Palestinians that are currently being held under administrative detention. And just to give you a sense of the scale here, there's about 3,500 Palestinians that are being held under administrative detention, who will continue to be held under administrative detention because it's not going away for Palestinians. There are eight um, there are eight Jews in the West Bank who are held under administrative detention, and they will probably all be released, and no future Jews will be held under administrative detention in the West Bank. And it's like, this ongoing campaign of the assimilation of the West Bank, which is turbocharging now that they're expecting a more friendly environment with Trump. This article in Haaretz, I feel like, did a really good job going into how the annexation of the West Bank will happen through the sort of concerted economic collapse of the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian economy there. It's a long read, but it's a really good one. It talks a lot about Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, who obviously is the sort of far-right fascist member of the Israeli cabinet, who has been an absolutely disastrous finance minister. Israel can't pass a budget. Their credit rating has collapsed, but he is extremely effective in the thing that he actually cares about, which is not finances for the broader Israeli economy, but the annexation of the West Bank. And so there's been a lot of withholding funds to the Palestinian Authority, for example, and sort of the strangulation of banking and other economic assets that are available in the West Bank. So by some estimates, the economy in the West Bank has shrunk by over 25% in the past year, which is disastrous, right? It's hard to overstate how big of a contraction that is. So where that goes is a little bit hard to know. And, obviously that level of active oppression often breeds resistance. So the long-term strategy here might be a really dangerous one, but we'll see what it ends up producing. The other sort of conflicting news that happened this week was in Qatar, where it appears that the Hamas office was closed, as we discussed last week, by U.S. pressure, sort of forcing Qatar to kick Hamas out. The Hamas leadership is now in Turkey, but both Qatar and Turkey and Hamas all say that this is just a temporary thing and they're not actually kicked out of the country and they'll be going back. So who knows? It's a little bit early to tell, as it was last week, but it continues to be early to tell. Last thing on like the situation specifically in Palestine that I wanted to touch on was just this article by a real remarkable set of people, including Noura Alakat and Josh Paul and some others, basically responding to an article in Foreign Affairs from August about how Israel was winning, basically saying that actually, no, this war is unwinnable, and getting into a lot of the detail about how, from the Israeli perspective, this war is totally unwinnable. And that, I think it does a really good job of explaining that the real objectives of this war, of course, are not the release of the hostages or whatever. They're clearly to make Palestinians, like Palestinian life, so difficult, right? And to make the situation in Gaza so unlivable that it can sort of act on its sort of continuing colonial territorial ambitions. It's a very good article, so I definitely recommend folks give that a read. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, we are seeing, last week we talked about how Netanyahu wanted to give Trump a post-election gift with a ceasefire in Lebanon. That does seem to be materializing, although, again, it's a little bit hard to say. For weeks now, the Israelis and the Americans have been crowing about how close a ceasefire is. Like, it's hours away, it's days away, it's hours away. And here we are, several weeks later, and nothing has really moved yet. And it seems that the same underlying issue that is blocking the ability of this thing move forward for the past few weeks is still the same sticking issue, which is that Israel wants the ceasefire to be written along the lines of the UN Resolution 1701, which means Hezbollah has to withdraw north of the Litani River and Israel needs to respect Lebanon's territorial integrity. But Israel wants to enforce that agreement. So they want to be a party to the agreement and enforce the agreement. So that's the same sticking point. It's a non-starter for Hezbollah and the Lebanese state generally, that Israel can't continue to violate Lebanon's territorial integrity if there's going to be any ceasefire. So nothing there has really moved. It makes it seem a little bit unlikely that things will move. There have been a new set of attacks, excuse me, a new set of Israeli attacks in Lebanon this past week, and their furthest incursion into Lebanon yet so far, all of which I think is an indication that Israel is trying to turn the screws here to sort of force Hezbollah and the Lebanese state into a ceasefire agreement. It doesn't appear to be working, and the airstrikes are obviously really devastating, but the ground offensives, despite the fact that they're moving further in, have broadly continued to be failures. Like they still haven't really been able to hold any ground. Israeli forces move in, they get attacked, and they retreat, and that is continuously happening. So I think it is clear that, at least from where I sit, it seems Israel is really keen for a ceasefire because its plans to sort of militarily control southern Lebanon are failing. Like they don't seem to be able to hold any territory here. So in the meantime, they are causing as much damage as possible, destroying as much of the infrastructure in the south as possible, and then hoping that leads to a ceasefire. It really is the Gaza strategy all over again, and we know how effective that was. Um, so, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if Israel budged on its territorial, like the in its demand of being able to still control Lebanese airspace. So I think what is going to happen in the ceasefire negotiations is that at some point Israel is going to say, fine, fine, like we will respect the territorial integrity of Lebanon, and that'll be the basis of the ceasefire. They may wait until January so that they can hand it to Trump that way. They may do a temporary ceasefire before then. And I could obviously be completely wrong, but that's where things seem to be headed given the balance of forces on the ground. More broadly, looking at the sort of genocide accusations being levied against Israel right now, there's a new advisory opinion like being asked for by Norway, specifically on Israel's banning of UNRWA and banning UNRWA's ability to operate in Gaza specifically. So this is like a UN General Assembly vote being put forward by Norway that would basically attempt to protect UNRWA and its operations. It'll certainly pass the General Assembly, but what it'll actually do in terms of its implementability is obviously the harder question here. And meanwhile, the Pope apparently has called directly for an investigation and saying specifically for the first time that what is happening in Gaza does appear to have the indications of a genocide, and saying that a lot of experts are calling it a genocide, so that we should look into that. Obviously the Pope's opinion doesn't carry a lot of weight on the international stage, but it does, I think, put a new kind of pressure on particularly US politicians who are very vocal about their adherence to their Catholicism, including one Mr. Joseph Robinette Biden, who's a very devout Catholic, and like here is the head of the Catholic Church telling him that it is a genocide. You would think that that would cause more embarrassment than, of course, it does, because these people don't care about hypocrisy or irony. So it'll be used, I think, effectively as a communication way of demonstrating the hypocrisy of those people. But of course, I wouldn't expect it to move them very much. Meanwhile, at the UN Security Council, as Thomas mentioned at the top, the US has vetoed the fourth Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. The excuses here are getting progressively thinner. The explanation that the State Department gave for why this resolution was vetoed is that the like the release of hostages has to be directly tied to the call for a ceasefire, which, sure, that has been the U.S. position this whole time, but like this resolution specifically did, in fact, call for the release of hostages. It is very similar to the one that the U.S. let pass, a few months ago. And so it just, I think, continues to show the extent to which the U.S. is clearly uninterested in a ceasefire and in looking for reasons um, to not allow this sort of ceasefire pressure to build. And so, despite the sort of working tirelessly for a ceasefire BS that you've been hearing from the administration, nothing materially has changed since last October, when back then, the administration was very clear about the fact that they didn't want a ceasefire. Now they've realized they have to say that they want a ceasefire, but then they will do everything in their power to make sure that it does not come to pass. In this community note on the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, I think really encapsulates it very well, where she talks about how only diplomacy will provide a path forward, and she gets community noted saying like, actually, you are the single individual that has blocked diplomatic solutions for the past year. Uh, the bigger, I would say, international news this week is, of course, the final, very delayed issuance of these arrest warrants for Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, despite the fact that he's been fired. He's still listed as one of the people that has warrants. And, because they had to put somebody from Hamas in, they put Mohammed Deif as the third person who's getting arrest warrants. Originally they were supposed to be issued for Ismail Haniyeh and Yahya Sinwar, but they're both dead. So, despite the fact that Mohammed Deif might also be dead, he's the only Palestinian listed in these arrest warrants. The arrest warrants are a big deal. They took way, way too long. I think the arrest warrants took about 3 weeks to be issued for Putin, and these arrest warrants took about half a year. So it tells you, I think, a lot about both U.S. and Israeli meddling at the ICC to slow the things down, to try to stop it from happening. I think the UK was also involved in this for a while. But they did finally get issued, and that is a big deal. And now what we're seeing is a series of different states, and interestingly, in the United States, a few cities stating that they will, in fact, honor those ICC arrest warrants. So uh, if Netanyahu or Gallant goes to that country, they will be arrested upon landing. Obviously, that's not going to happen. Netanyahu doesn't just like show up someplace without clearing it with that government first. So this isn't going to lead to him actually being arrested. What it does is severely constrict his ability to operate, right? Like it's a black stain on, his like legacy, to the extent that he has a legacy that is anything but a black stain. Um, and it restricts his ability to like go to Canada or other places in a way that does feel really meaningful. There's also a series of sort of follow-on effects here as they relate to um, the ways that like corporate liability and things will limit the ability for multilaterals to work with Israel and things like that. So there are going to be serious economic implications for this as well. And of course, in the United States, what we're seeing is a group of politicians who are so keen on the ICC arrest warrants for Putin now talking about how totally illegitimate the ICC is, despite the fact that they were cheerleading it, just over a year ago. You could see like Lindsey Graham, for example, saying that the ICC arrest warrants for Putin were an active international evidence-based body, whereas the arrest warrants for Israel are, the result of a dangerous joke. It's worth noting, by the way, that the panel of experts organized by Karim Khan for these arrest warrants was specifically designed to address and minimize the possibility that accusations of anti-Semitism could be used here. One of the experts is a Israeli citizen Holocaust survivor who is the former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. And he also concluded that these arrest warrants needed to be issued. So like, no one on this call needs to hear this, but like, obviously the ICC is not operating out of anti-Semitism here. This whole thing is being run by people who were handpicked by the United States and Israel. And the fact that even they feel like they absolutely have to issue these arrest warrants, I think is really telling. Meanwhile, the incoming Republican government is already talking about sanctioning the ICC, and Tom Cotton has been going off about invading The Hague and whatever, your usual sort of bad guy bombast. But I don't know that much will come from it, although I wouldn't be surprised if we saw ICC sanctioning coming out of the US government in the next few months. On the domestic front, a few really important bills that passed or didn't pass this week. Top among them, at least for me, was the Bernie Sanders joint resolutions of disapproval. These 6 bills that were aimed to block specific weapons shipments to Israel, and these are specifically offensive weapons shipments to Israel. It got obviously broad civil society support, including 100 or so of civil society groups that signed letters and petitions. Local government officials here, organized by AROC Action, I believe, sent a letter to the California senators basically saying, all the constituents we represent are asking you to actually to vote yes on this. SEIU, not like a local chapter of the SEIU, but the entire Service Employees International Union, put out a resolution in support of the JRDs. So the level of support here is really remarkable, really, really remarkable. In its face was an unprecedented, honestly, an unprecedented level of pushback, both from the Biden administration and from AIPAC, where Biden was himself calling senators, trying to get them to vote no on these resolutions, basically saying that any opposition to offensive weaponry is in fact a gift to Hamas, this sort of like tired old line, only used by like AIPAC talking points and their proxies. AIPAC itself was running TV ads, and like a broad marketing campaign, basically to get people to call their senators. It worked. Like from what we heard from senators' offices, they were getting an unprecedented number of calls telling them to vote no on these JRDs. And in spite of all of that, 19 senators still voted yes. That's a remarkably high number. And that includes, I think, 7 senators who sit on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who actually have like meaningful power as it relates to U.S. relations with Israel. So the fact that, not quite half, but well over a third of Democratic senators voted to stop arms from being shipped to Israel is a really, really big deal. I think it's something that we should consider to be like a pretty significant tide change, demonstrating the extent to which the democratic consensus on Israel is fractured, and that senators, even in the face of massive AIPAC pressure, recognize that they feel like they have to vote against these weapon shipments, not only because they're objectively illegal, both under US and international law, but because they feel like they'll pay a price politically. So amazing to see the limitations of AIPAC's capability like this, really amazing. There is some effort right now to sort of bolster up those senators that voted yes, and I'll come back to that. But the other nightmare bill that came through this week was HR 9495, the so-called nonprofit killer bill. It is, we talked about it a lot last week, so I don't think we need to get into too much detail here. If you are new this week, just watch last week's PSA or read an article. This Nation article by Daryl Lee is a really, really good one. I think speaks to the extent to which this is really obviously designed not only to silence Palestinian organizations, although that is the sort of like explicit reason for it, but also is sort of the wedge by which they can then use it to sort of attack other progressive movement organizations. And we're already starting to see that expansion, despite the fact that this isn't a law yet, right? It passed the House, but it still needs to go through the Senate. Where the Climate Justice Alliance, which has been a very like pro-Palestinian, not that different from the Sunrise Movement level of solidarity with Palestine, environmental justice organization, is now being denied federal funding. And they're being denied federal funding basically explicitly because of their solidarity with Palestine. So it starts there, but there is a broader strategy here specifically to undermine environmental justice and environmental organizations because, again, Republicans and frankly the capitalist class generally needs those organizations shut down so that they can continue to burn and cook the entire planet. It's worth noting that it's not clear yet how this bill will fare in the Senate. So obviously Republicans are very keen on it generally, but as we've seen, I think the Democrats are recognizing the limitations here. The difference in the Democratic vote from the last time this bill came up, 2 weeks ago, versus the vote yesterday, I think tells us a lot about how that pressure is working. The bill from 2 weeks ago had, I think, 52 Democratic senators who voted yes on that bill, including our dear future Senator Adam Schiff. This time, that number went down to like just over a dozen, I think 15 or so. So the overwhelming majority of Democrats who voted for it last time voted no this time. And I think that is a direct result of the pressure campaigns that a lot of folks did to call those offices and tell them that those votes are unacceptable, including Adam Schiff, by the way, who switched his vote from yes to no over the course of those couple of weeks, and said explicitly that it was partly a result of what he heard from his constituents. So just to say that I think there's a lot of Democratic reticence on this bill being passed, and I think there is a little bit of Republican fear that it's going to be used against like January 6th type people. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen to it at the Senate level, but we'll know more, when we know more. At the BDS level, a couple of huge things this week. First, the Alameda Labor Council passed some remarkable resolutions calling for a halt of military aid to Israel and divestment campaigns across Alameda County. So this is like laying the groundwork for that Alameda County divestment push for total divestment from Israel. So a great step in that direction. And then I also wanted to just highlight this incredible tool produced by Progressive International that names companies that are complicit in Israel's war on Gaza, the Watermelon Index. It's remarkable. I spent way too much time playing around in there, so I would recommend that you do the same. The last article thing that I wanted to go over was this New Yorker article about digital security and the Trump administration's use of particular technology. Unsurprisingly, this is very deeply related to Palestine because the organizations that are being contracted with the US government are Israeli firms, including this spyware firm Graphite that it has a new $2 million contract with the Department of Homeland Security. And their whole thing is breaching Signal and some other encrypted apps. But the US government is investing millions of dollars in Israeli spyware that allows them to access Signal and other sorts of encrypted communication. And a very obvious part of this is to infiltrate and surveil pro-Palestinian movements. So rejoinder, as I have done many times in the past, that level of digital security is going to be a critical part of organizing in the coming year and making sure that folks are thoughtful about how they are not only keeping themselves safe, but your digital security obviously impacts everyone that you're in connection with. So making sure that you're being thoughtful about that in a way that allows other people to also be safe. I'm sure there are some trainings and some stuff coming down the pipe on this that it would be good for folks to attend. So yeah, that's also just a really fascinating article. Generally, I definitely recommend people give it a read. And so, in sum, Israel once again is punishing Gaza because of its own embarrassment on the global stage. In addition to that, the general's plan in northern Gaza continues really unabated. It continues to get worse in a way that it feels unimaginable that it's getting worse, and yet it is. So how the situation in northern Gaza will resolve itself, I truly don't know, but it looks more bleak by the week. The Lebanon ceasefire does appear to be moving along on some level, but will require full Israeli withdrawal and for that withdrawal to be ostensibly permanent. So might that be a January thing, or maybe it'll happen earlier, but we'll see. The ICC arrest warrants are a really big deal, even if they're late and even if they're compromised, and even if it doesn't really impact Netanyahu's ability to come to the United States. It does constrain him and the Israeli government generally in a lot of different ways. And lastly, these joint resolutions of disapproval and the other bills that came through the House and the Senate this week, including HR 9495. I think are a really powerful indication of both our strength and our vulnerability in this moment, right? Like our ability to mobilize that number of senators, our ability to create that level of political pressure something that definitely did not exist a year ago. And I think it's a real testament to the organizing and to the extent of popular opinion changing that has been happening over these last months. And because of that strength, we are now more vulnerable, right? That's the great irony of like as you sort of more effectively challenge systems of power, obviously repression ramps up in response. And so we're seeing that happen, right? And HR 495 is a clear example of that. And we need to be ready for that in a way that, is going to take a lot of organizing and a lot of solidarity and a lot of building between now and mid-January. So those are things I'm sure will come up in future PSAs. So upcoming actions, I want to highlight this AROC action tool that thanks senators who are voting to block weapons to Israel. It's really important, I think, to push back on, they're getting hammered by AIPAC right now. So it's really good to give them some sense of community support for voting the right way on this bill. It's a very quick form to fill out. And there is a debrief on how the JRD stuff went and like the broader weapon sales to Israel stuff happening next Tuesday, hosted by a series of good organizations. So I definitely recommend folks give that a look. And then if you want to know more about what's happening, please do check out the event calendar on the AROC website. It is filled to the brim with stuff in November, which is exciting. If you want text alerts for what's happening, including upcoming mobilizations, please do text PSA to 833-633-0604 and check out the Palestine Media Tracker for information on those stories and articles that inform this analysis. You can sign up at palmediatracker.com/signup.